easy one. So object-oriented programming is a way to build and structure computer programs. There are other ways of doing this. There's also functional programming, procedural programming, logic programming, and a bunch of others. And these are all called programming paradigms. Before we get into object-oriented programming, we're gonna look into two other paradigms, procedural and functional, to get a wider view on what programming paradigm is and hopefully a better understanding of object-oriented programming through contrast. So the first one that we're gonna look into is procedural programming, and this is probably the most straightforward and easy one. This one comes from structural programming, and the code just executes from top to bottom, and yeah, there's not much to say here. If the code gets too complex, you can split it into modules or functions. So let's look at an example. Here we have a similar program to the one of previous video, where we have let's say we have a dog, and if the dog is hungry, it will change text from sleep to bark. That's pretty much it. So quick reminder from last video, this part here, this will be the state of the program, composed of the data they can hold. So in this case it will be husky, true, and sleep. And then this part will be the behavior, which is what's gonna change the state of the program. So in this case, when it's hungry, it's gonna change bark, text to bark. So it's gonna change that state from this to the same but text being bark. So here it's gonna bring bark. That's procedural programming. This is probably the way that most people learn how to program, first hands-on. You can still find it on some low-level languages like assembly, for example. Now, next we're gonna look into functional programming, and as the name suggests, the the main focus on this paradigm is to organize your code in functions. Now, if we recall from the previous video, the concept of state and behavior, again this would be this state, but this function will be the behavior. And this is a very important point. The behavior and functional programming only exists on functions, on pure functions. So the behavior does not depend on the state of the program, unlike it could happen with procedural programming, because like this part is the behavior, but depending of hungry, it's gonna do one thing or another. But here it does not depend on that at all. It just takes one parameter, makes a copy of it, and gives out one output. So the behavior is stateless. It does not depend on the state of the program, on the data. It's a pure function. That's a very important concept of functional programming. And since it's a pure function, it won't modify the previous state of the program. It can create new data, but it won't modify like previous data. So yeah, that's the main overview of functional and procedural. There is of course more stuff to them, but since this course is about object-oriented programming, we're not gonna get into too much detail or more than this. Okay. Before we saw functional programming and how it organizes its code in functions. So as you might guess, in object-oriented programming, we're gonna organize our code in objects. Now, what's an object? Well, as analogy with like functional programming, in functional programming, the functions encapsulate the behavior of the program. So in object-oriented programming, we're gonna encapsulate the behavior and the state or the data of code that is somehow related in some way. So for example, in procedural programming we have like breathe is hungry and text, which is like data that is related to dog, right? So we're gonna encapsulate those three properties on a dog object. So that data is gonna be here. And then also the behavior that is related to dog, which is barking. We're gonna put it inside this container, barking behavior, and also another behavior to return the text. So that's the main gist of it. In object-oriented programming, you will encapsulate the data and the behavior of stuff that's related into objects, and that's an object. That's a very important point. Alright, so here we create the object using a class. What is a class? A class is simply a template that we use to create objects from that template. So this will be the dog class, and what this class can do is generate objects from here. So here we're generating this object, which will contain the data that we're giving it. So ASCII, true, and sleep, and also all the behavior associated to this data. So barking and get text. But I could also generate like another object with different data. So instead of ASCII, I could put like golden retriever, instead of true, false, and instead of sleep, I could put like awake or something. And then it would inherit the behavior from the class as well. So that's the main idea of class and object. And then afterwards, through the object, we will call its behavior. And then here in print, instead of just print, since we just want to keep it like pure object-oriented programming, I put like some invented object called O, and then call its behavior print, and then just pass the text parameter that I get through get text behavior. So that's the main gist of it. Don't worry if it seems a bit too abstract or complicated, because on the next videos we're gonna take a more practical approach by looking at all of this in Java. So for now, just stay with the idea that object-oriented programming, you try to encapsulate everything that's related in. You try to encapsulate the data and the behavior of stuff that's related into containers that we call object. And that's the main idea. Okay, see you on the next videos in which we're gonna look at the 4 main principles of object-oriented programming.